Tim the Trickster and the Never-Ending Tales. In a small, peaceful village at the edge of a vast forest, there lived a boy named Tim. Tim wasn't your typical boy. He had a talent that made him both famous and infamous in his village. He was an extraordinary storyteller. But there was a catch: none of his stories were true. Tim was known as a fibber, a trickster, and though his stories captivated everyone around him, they were filled with impossible tales and wild exaggerations. Tim wasn't trying to hurt anyone with his lies. He simply loved the thrill of spinning a good yarn, watching people's eyes widen with disbelief, and hearing the laughter that often followed. He thought of himself as an entertainer, a weaver of worlds that were far more interesting than the sleepy village where he lived. In Tim's stories, the ordinary became extraordinary. A trip to the grocery store turned into a daring chase with pirates. A visit to the doctor transformed into a secret mission to save a magical kingdom. One day, while playing in the schoolyard, Tim decided to share his most outrageous story yet. He gathered a group of his classmates, eyes twinkling with mischief, and began. "Did you know," Tim said, lowering his voice to a whisper, "my uncle lives on the moon?" His friends gasped. "The moon? No way." "Oh yes," Tim nodded confidently. "He's an astronaut, but not just any astronaut. He's the king of the moon people. They built him a palace up there, and he gets to ride around on a flying horse made of stardust. He even sends me letters sometimes, and they're written in moon dust." The children were enthralled. Tim's stories were always wild, but this was something else. "Can we see the letters?" one of his friends asked eagerly. "Of course," Tim replied smoothly. "Next time he sends one, I'll bring it to school." Days passed, and though Tim never brought in any letters, his classmates still buzzed with excitement, imagining what it must be like to have an uncle living on the moon. Tim, basking in the attention, began to think of more stories to tell. He claimed his uncle had sent him a pet lion from the moon, a lion that could turn invisible at will. "He's here right now," Tim would say, pointing to the empty space beside him. "But he's in stealth mode. You can't see him, but he's watching." At first, the children loved Tim's stories. They begged him for more each day. But as time went on, cracks began to show in his tales. When Tim's lion never appeared, and when his uncle's moon letters never arrived, the other kids started to grow suspicious. They realized that Tim was just making everything up, and slowly but surely, their excitement turned into annoyance. One afternoon, after telling yet another tall tale about finding a treasure chest filled with gold and jewels in his backyard, one of Tim's friends, Sarah, crossed her arms and frowned. "Tim, you're always making things up. We've never seen any of the things you talk about. Why should we believe you anymore?" Tim, surprised by her outburst, blinked. "Because it's fun," he said defensively. "Don't you like hearing my stories?" Sarah shook her head. "We did at first. But now it's just frustrating. None of it's real, and you're always promising things that never happen." Tim didn't know what to say. He had always thought people liked his stories, but now it seemed they were tired of them. Feeling a little guilty, he mumbled an apology and slunk away, wondering if he had pushed things too far. But the very next day, unable to resist, Tim came up with his biggest and boldest story yet. He claimed that deep in the forest behind the village was a magical treasure, hidden centuries ago by a powerful wizard. The treasure, he said, was protected by ancient spells, and only someone with a map, like the one Tim had in his possession, could find it. "I can take you all there," Tim boasted, waving a piece of crumpled paper in the air. "We'll be rich. But you have to promise to follow me and do exactly as I say." His classmates, despite their growing doubts, couldn't resist the allure of treasure. Maybe, just maybe, this time Tim was telling the truth. So they agreed to follow him. That afternoon after school, Tim led the group of eager children into the forest. They trudged through thick underbrush, crossed streams, and climbed over fallen logs, all while Tim pretended to consult his so-called map. Hours passed, and though the children grew tired and hungry, they continued to follow Tim, their excitement slowly turning into frustration. "Are we almost there?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Just a little farther," Tim insisted. "The treasure's just beyond that hill." But when they finally reached the hill, there was nothing. No treasure, no wizard's cave, nothing but trees and more trees. "That's it!" Sarah shouted, throwing her hands up in the air. "You lied again, Tim. There's no treasure." The other children, realizing they had been tricked once more, began to grumble angrily. Some of them started walking back toward the village, disappointed and annoyed. Tim stood there, feeling small and ashamed. He hadn't meant to upset anyone. He just wanted to have fun, to share his wild imagination with his friends. But now, standing alone in the forest, he realized that his lies had gone too far. When he returned to the village, Tim knew he had to make things right. The next day at school, he stood in front of his classmates and admitted the truth. "I'm sorry," Tim said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I made everything up. My uncle doesn't live on the moon, and there's no magical treasure. I just wanted to make things exciting, but I realize now that I shouldn't have lied." His classmates, though still a bit upset, could see that Tim was truly sorry. Sarah stepped forward and smiled. "It's okay, Tim. We like you. You don't have to make up stories to be interesting." From that day on, Tim made a promise to himself. No more lies. Instead of creating wild, impossible stories, he started to focus on the real adventures around him. And to his surprise, he found that real life could be just as exciting, if not more so, than the tales he had once invented. Tim still loved to tell stories, but now they were based on the world around him. He talked about the time he helped his grandfather plant a garden, or the day he got lost in the forest and found his way back by following the sound of a stream. His friends, instead of rolling their eyes, began to listen with genuine interest. And so, Tim the trickster became Tim the truth-teller. He learned that while imagination was a gift, honesty was what truly mattered. And in the end, it was the truth that made his stories worth hearing.